Hello everyone. For some reason this makes my mouse disappear, but that's fine. Welcome back to the SMITE support build discussion. Today we'll be talking about auto attack builds for Guardians. We'll also be talking about warriors, warrior builds, building a warrior in the support role. I'm also going to be talking about unique facets of both Guardians and Warriors that might affect how you might build them for a support, because the previous episode we laid kind of the groundwork on the basics of most building, support building for most matches, so now we're going to get into the weeds here. So for auto attack support builds with Guardians, this is rather interesting because I'm specifically, this isn't the only way to auto attack build. I'll talk about another way in a bit, but when I'm talking about auto attack builds for supports, I am specifically talking about animosity builds. And again, there are some Guardians that are really good at this and some that are not. So I'm going to talk about the ones that I've found personally to be pretty good at this, or at least decent at this. But in order to kind of lay the groundwork for the basics of an auto attack support build, we're actually going to talk about Cthulhu, who actually plays support very well while playing an auto attack support build, because the final hit of his basic attack chain, which you can see here, actually gives Torment, which in turn increases the damage mitigation of Sanity Break. So you actually, playing Cthulhu auto attack build is actually a fairly decent strategy here. So when you're approaching an auto attack build, you're going to start with, obviously, Benevolence, because that's going to eventually evolve into Animosity. Now, the only real problem with Benevolence as a support, and I've mentioned this before, I believe I mentioned this in the previous episode, if not, it was definitely a different video somewhere else. The problem with this is you're pretty frequently going to be near an allied god, because that's part of your job, so building up these stacks of Benevolence can be pretty difficult. Yes, you get 4 stacks on assists, but it's a lot faster to build these up when you're not near an ally, so it can take a little while longer to build these up, and that can be somewhat problematic. There are some Guardians that are actually good at this, I'll talk about that, but it is a bit of a problem. It's a little less of a problem with Cthulhu because he actually has the kind of kit where he could, if he wanted to, wander off by himself and do some damage if he really wanted to. But anyways, when you are going through an animosity build, this is obviously the starter item. Now, I usually, and I recommend this as well, even though you will eventually be fairly aggressive, you really should be grabbing Gauntlet of Thebes early on first. This provides you with some HP. Obviously, animosity increases based on max HP. But this is also going to give you 60 of each protection, which is really important because your starter item doesn't actually give you any protections. The reason why Gauntlet of Thebes is fine here is because you are using Benevolence. You are going to want to play a little bit more passive in the beginning. I know some people find Gauntlet of Thebes too slow, but when you build Benevolence with the intention of going Animosity later on in the game, you're basically trading your early game potential for late game damage, essentially speaking. So you want to play more passively in the early game, and Gauntlet of Thebes is really going to help you with that. You're already going to be playing passively. You don't need those necessarily protections right away, so you can build Gauntlet of Thebes, play it safe. This generally, by the way, this is a really good point at which to mention this, animosity builds generally tend to work slightly better if you're in communication with either your ADC or your mid. So if you're partying up with either or both of those, that's a little bit better, because you can then communicate to them more clearly that you don't want to play as aggressively. In randoms, you may want to indicate that. You might want to type it in chat or something that, hey, I'm going for an animosity build. Let's cool the early game so I can really slap in the late game. Maybe they'll understand, maybe they won't. I've had somewhat mixed reviews on that, because obviously at that point they don't know how effective or not you're going to be in the late game. If you're really insistent on going aggressive, either because that's just how you play, or that's just how you prefer to compensate for the lack of protections on Benevolence, you can run some protections. Now, if you're going to run protections and you're not going to go for Gauntlet of Thebes because you are going to be fairly aggressive, a decent start would be Stone of Fall. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. Actually, also, Stone of Binding is a good second item as well if you want some protections. Probably, well, Stone of Binding, it really depends on the god in question. For Cthulhu, Stone of Binding is fine. He actually does fairly well with this. But if you are like, okay, I'm going to go for this animosity build, I need protections right now because I want to really aggress on them, I want to stomp them into the ground, Stone of Binding is going to be your go-to here, in most cases. Otherwise, if you don't want to go for Stone of Binding because you're going to wind up selling it later on, you could absolutely go Stone of Fall. It's not that much more expensive, actually, as far as support items go. It's well, as far as support items go, it's a little bit more expensive, but it also provides you with a lot of benefits as well. The reason I prefer, very specifically, Gauntlet of Thebes is I'm already, like I said, I'm a bit more of a defensive support player in the first place. Second off, it does provide me with a large amount of protections and a good amount of health. But again, I would recommend, if you're not going to go for Gauntlet of Thebes, I do recommend Stone of Binding. That's 1,700 for 30 of each protection, which is exactly what, say, as a comparison, that's what Pridwin is going to offer you, but for 700 gold cheaper. So it's a really good, strong early pick. It also offers you 10 MP5, which is really nice. The 25 magic power we don't really care about. Even with an animosity build, we just don't care about magic power. We care more about health. But that's, you know, that's actually a really strong starting option if you're not going to go for the gauntlet. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and use this because I am assuming, based on a lot of my feedback, I've noticed a lot of the support players who watch me are more aggressive than I am with their support role. Either I'm really old school in my supporting, or this is the new age that of aggressive supports, and I just happen to be so used to playing defensive support that I can play it well enough that I can make it work. I don't know which yet. But I've noticed that a large amount of my support viewers are a bit more aggressive than I am. So we're going to go on ahead and use Stone of Binding here, because for a lot of you watching this who are support mains, or a lot of you who are non-support mains and are either looking to get into supporting but want to do damage, say you're an ADC main who wants to splash into support, this is a really great option for you, because this is going to be basically like playing a long-term ADC game, right? You're just building protections into the power, and then at the end you're starting to actually slap with your auto attacks. All of you are going to be more aggressive players than me, so I'm going to go on ahead and make that assumption here. So we're going to go ahead and go for Stone of Binding. Now, whether or not you go for Gauntlet of Thebes afterwards, that's up to you. I do recommend it because, again, you are getting a lot of protections out of this item. It is giving you some health. It is still helping your allies, so you're still able to maintain that support role, that support function there. You are providing your allies with an aura that does increase their protections. So with Stone of Binding, you're decreasing their protections by 10. With Gauntlet of Thebes, you're increasing your allies' protections by 10. That's a fairly nice deal. Now, at this particular point in time, this is, obviously it's your first three items, your groundwork, and then at this point you're going to be building. Normally you would build to sort of compensate for what the enemy team composition is. When you're going with an animosity build, you really don't, actually, because one of the items you're going to build, and I'm going to go on ahead and put this in because you're always going to be building this, it's just a matter of when. My mouse disappears every time I press the record button for some reason. I still haven't figured out why, but here we go. You're going to be wanting to go for Shogun's Kusari at some point for the attack speed increase, for the health, for the magic protections, for the cooldown, for the MP5. In the previous episode, I did mention, hey, there are some situations in which Talisman of Energy is a better pick than Shogun's Kusari. Some situations. But when you're going animosity, Shogun's Kusari is the go-to, because it is going to give you that increased attack speed. You're not going to care quite as much about a movement speed or MP5, although MP5 is nice. Shogun's Kusari is going to give you cooldown reduction, which matters for some supports going for animosity builds. It matters for Cthulhu because you actually are able to use your sanity break more frequently, which is, a good source of damage mitigation. Again, you're going with auto attacks here, so you're actually able to work up that torment, that insanity, faster than normal because you're actually going to be fairly invested in your auto attacks. So you actually want to be using Sanity Break a little bit more. So the cooldown here is really nice. Whether or not you build this as your 4th or 5th item really depends on how much magic damage the enemy has on their team. Typically, I'll build this as my 5th item because in that particular instance, the average team comp has 3 physicals, 2 magic, and one of those magic is the enemy guardian, who usually isn't going to be hitting that hard. So you can usually wait until the 5th item for this. Again, you're still providing some benefits to your allies. It's just more... part of the reason here is specifically to enhance yourself. Now, for physical... No, I can't find my mouse. There it is. Yeah, it's a pain in the neck. Oh yeah, there we go. Now, for physical protections, what you build very specifically is going to depend very wildly on what you think you need. This is probably the only item in this build that is very specifically counter build. Alright, now what I build here is going to depend on the situation. If the enemy team has healing, this is where I'm going to be building my anti-heal in the form of Contagion, because this does give me some health. I'm already going to be using Shogun's Kusari as my heavy amount of magic protections, so I don't usually want Pestilence in my build, but Contagion works the same way. Also has physical protection, also it has health. So if the enemy has enough healing, my physical item is going to be Contagion. Okay? If the enemy team has a lot of auto attackers, I'll either go... Usually I'm going to go Jade Emperor's Crown. It gives you 300 health nowadays. It gives you 50 physical protection. It's reducing the enemy physical power by 15%. Maybe, you know, if they have enough auto attackers as well, I might go for Witchblade. Whether you use Witchblade or Jade Emperor's Crown for enemy auto attackers is really up to you. It's down to your preference. Witchblade offers you some cooldowns and slightly less health and slightly less physical protections. Jade Emperor's Crown offers you slightly more physical protections, but it doesn't offer you cooldowns. Offers you 50 more health. This offers you move speed. Jade Emperor's Crown does not. This comes down to personal preference between the two, but whenever I am playing against auto attack heavy comps, I am building one of these two. If another option, but I don't really use this as much anymore, is Midgardian Mail. It's just not really my favorite too much anymore. Just because Jade Emperor's Crown and Witchblade generally tend to be better. There are situations in which I will still use this, namely those situations in which the enemy team doesn't have a lot of escapes. Sometimes the enemy will make a mistake, auto-attack you, have a reduced movement speed, and that allows you to catch up and slap them. So I've had some success with this. If you expect to box a lot, you expect to box a lot of auto-attackers, this actually might be worth it. It depends on how... The more often you find yourself alone when building animosity builds, the more useful Midgardian Mail is, basically. I don't often try to engage solo, you know, in 1v1s with animosity, so I don't find this particularly useful. But let's say an ADC main is in the Guardian role, builds animosity build. They're used to boxing targets, so they might find more use out of this than the other two options. Again, this is something I'll only build if the enemy team has enough auto-attackers on their team composition, but that's just kind of an example of where I would probably go with a lot of this. Now, in this particular instance, because I am Cthulhu, I would probably... Hey, my mouse is back. I would probably build Witchblade, because, again, I am looking for that cooldown. I am looking to use Sanity Break a lot, so that way I can gain the benefit of that bonus damage mitigation for my auto attacks. So Witchblade, at least for Cthulhu, is going to be my go-to in this situation. Again, if you prefer one of the other two, that is down to your preference, but you should be building one of the three if there's a lot of auto attackers. If there's nothing special going on, right, and it's just standard, you know, a lot of ability-based physical, they don't have too many auto-attackers, they don't have copious amounts of healing, I'm just going to go on ahead and default to Sovereignty a lot of the time. Again, give your allies some physical protections, give yourself some physical protections, give yourself some nice health here to work with. It's a wonderful time. I don't usually build Mystical Mail because a lot of the time I'm already going to be doing magic damage with Animosity, and I just don't find Mystical Mail as useful. If you like Mystical Mail and none of the other conditions have been filled, go for it, absolutely, but generally speaking, this is not going to be my go-to here. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. Now that we've covered that, I'm going to go on ahead and I'm going to assume auto attackers here. We're going to go ahead and throw Witchblade in there, alright? For kicks. So now we've got our Benevolence. We built Stone of Binding, Gauntlet of Thebes. We're going to assume this is fully stacked. Shogun's Gusari. It does not do the stacked version. Alright. Shogun's Gusari and Witchblade. Okay. Here, we're going to actually, really quickly, just so we have at least some representation of this, we're going to throw Mantle of Discord right there, just so we can pretend, oh yeah, here's the protections we'd have with Gauntlet of Thebes, or 5 less anyways. So we've got these 5 items. Now, at this particular point, you probably are about level 15 at this junction, approximately speaking. Remember that Stone of Binding is a little cheaper than average, and Witchblade is fairly cheap as well. So you're probably about level 15 at this point. Maybe you go on ahead and build up to Benevolence. I'm sorry, not Benevolence, Animosity. Where'd you go? There you are. And then you have your 400 health, you have your basic attacks is dealing 3%. Yay, it's a lovely time. Now, what about our last item? Well, at this particular point, our last item should be Stone of Fall. Again, this is something you really want whenever you hit an enemy god with a basic attack. You gain a stack of False Blessing, 2% damage mitigation. It's actually this 2% damage mitigation that I really love on Cthulhu, because that's going to stack with Sanity Break, which is a really lovely time for you. In this particular instance, we've got Stone of Fall. Now you're probably wondering, well, Professor, what about Stone of Binding? What are we going to replace Stone of Binding with? Now, in this particular case, I prefer, at least with Cthulhu, I prefer Spirit Robe. It gives me a little bit more of both protections. It gives me a little bit more cooldown. Again, something I want with an Animosity Cthulhu. And it's going to give me crowd control reduction and bonus damage mitigation. If there's a particularly heavy amount of magic damage, say they have 4 magic damage, I might instead go for Oni Hunter's Garb. Again, that depends on how much magic damage they are doing. If they have an abnormally high amount of physical attackers, say they have 4 physical people, I might build, I already have Witchblade here, so let's go on ahead and go for Jade Emperor's Crown. I might go Jade Emperor's Crown. These are kind of conditional depending on how the team comp is. With Spirit Robe, I am assuming 3 physical, 2 magic, which is standard, so I'm going to usually go for Spirit Robe. But these two are really good items to build if the enemy team composition favors one of the other damage type very specifically, and that's generally where I'm going to go with that, okay? Now, at this particular point, behold, we have good old, that is just 250 health. Now we're just going to go ahead and splash this in here because I want to point out really quickly the health. We have 3,900 health, right? That's a good amount of health. Now, we are doing, with our auto attacks from Animosity, 117 damage with this. Alright, that is how much bonus damage our auto attacks are doing with Animosity, which is a pretty good amount of damage. Alright, we're going to go on ahead and throw in Spirit Robe. And I also want to point out that this is the protections without the Gauntlet of Thebes stacks. This is actually increased by 60, so you're looking at 269 physical protections, 252 magic protections. So you've still got a really strong amount of protections as well. Just as a case in point, really quickly undo this. Boom. I mean, this is 5 less, but you can definitely see where you're still bringing to bear a lot of really great protections. So this is a really great build, and again, it's particularly good for Cthulhu because he can turn that auto attack into damage mitigation on Sanity Break, which is a really nice bonus for Cthulhu, and one of the reasons why Cthulhu is kind of the holy grail of Animosity builds. But now that we've laid down the kind of basic groundwork on what an Animosity build looks like, or at least the way I personally build Animosity builds. Again, Spirit Robe is kind of specific to Cthulhu, and I chose Witchblade over the other two options because of Cthulhu. I'll talk about mild adjustments a little bit later on, but now you can see, okay, this is, how I build Animosity builds, this is why it works. Again, you get a lot of damage mitigation out of Stone of Fall. Spirit Robe, you're surprisingly very hard to kill, even with not 100% focusing on protections. And again, this is a really great way of being able to deal some damage as a support if you either don't like playing support normally, or if you're, an ADC main and you're just more used to dealing damage with your auto attacks and you miss that, but you want to play support. This is a great way of both being a good support and dealing some decent damage. Again, there are very specific Guardians that I prefer this on. Cthulhu is one of them. Another standout is Sylvanas. A lot of people, they build... I don't know why. I thought they were going to mention here that his auto attacks are AoE. A lot of people build... Actually, I'm going to go into the God Builder for this, thinking about it. A lot of people build Gilded Arrows, so that way they can go into Diamond Arrow later on. Right? A lot of people do that. Okay, but I want to actually do a comparison really quick here. Because this is, don't get me wrong, this is fairly nice. We bust out Animosity. We bust out Gauntlet of Thebes. We bust out, we're just going to go on ahead and run all the way to the end build here. Because I just want you to see very distinctly. With Sylvanas, what would we... we would probably normally want Jade Emperor's Crown, I think, would probably be ideal. We'll just assume auto attackers. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And then for the last one... yeah, we're going to go on ahead and go with Pridwin with Sylvanas because he wants those cooldowns. Now, we are at 386... what am I talking about? 3864. That is going to wind up at the 3% for Animosity. That is 116 bonus damage on your auto attacks. Alright, 116. This is 80. Okay? I want you to understand that, again, for Guardians specifically, and some Warriors, Animosity is better than Diamond Arrow. There are Guardians that prefer Diamond Arrow, but Sylvanas is not one of them. Now, there is a caveat to this. There is an asterisk to this comparison. Gilded Arrow is much better for Sylvanas' early game. I will freely admit that. If you want a stronger early game, you want Gilded Arrow. However, in the long run, Animosity does more for Sylvanas' auto attack damage than Diamond Arrow will ever do. Yes, you get increased attack speed here. But only 20%. Well, technically speaking, 60%. But that is off his baseline attack speed, which is only 1.04. So you're only getting, like, 1.64 attack speed tops. That doesn't include the, the Shogun's Gusari eventually, but whenever you see an attack speed increase, it's going off of the base attack speed here, which again is 1.04 here, so you're getting to 1.64 with Diamond Arrow, but you're doing very nearly 40 less damage per auto attack, so that's going to become an interesting comparison. Again, whenever you kill an enemy with, and Sylvanas, even with auto-attacking with Diamond Arrow, you're not necessarily always going to kill an enemy. You only have, really... Well, you have 3 damaging abilities, you don't have 4, and your auto-attacks are good, but you have to kill an enemy to get that attack speed boost. You don't have to kill anyone to get the boost from Animosity. So, personally, I prefer Animosity. I'll take the loss of attack speed for a more consistent... Well, I'll take the loss of inconsistent attack speed boosts for a consistent 3% additional... Oh, I'm sorry, for an additional 116 damage. Thank you very much. But that's just something that I wanted to really point out. Again, Gilded Arrow is better for his early game, but Animosity is going to do more damage for him more consistently in the long run. And again, that's also, don't forget that's an AoE auto attack, so that 116 bonus damage is hitting everything in that area, which is incredibly potent in team fights. Okay? So we have that. Alright? Oh, by the way, incidentally, another interesting thing is, again, you could go into Lotus Crown if you want to, with Sylvanas, with Animosity. I don't tend to because it doesn't offer him health, but you can. Another interesting thing is for his final item, you could, if you wanted to, go into Rod of Asclepius. That does give you some health. Again, I don't necessarily really do this because it isn't, offering him any protections, and I'm running slightly low on protections because Animosity doesn't offer me any, so I don't usually go for this. You're probably also wondering, Professor, why not build E-Staff? I've tried E-Staff. I really wanted E-Staff to work. I tried it for a long time. Problem with E-Staff is the same problem with Rod of Asclepius, just not enough protections. Having a lot of health is really nice, but at the end of the day, I try to keep around 250 protections nowadays, just because of how much penetration there is. Executioner is scary, alright? Very specifically, Executioner is a problem. I can't get E-Staff to work consistently well. If the enemy team doesn't build Executioner, you can probably get away with it. If the enemy does in fact build Executioner, you're doomed. You might be thinking, well, Executioner is a percentage reduction. Yes, but when you already are, down a little bit on protections from building Animosity instead of, say, Sentinel's Gift, E-Staff not having any protections on it either can somewhat hurt you. And Executioner is just going to have a field day, even with your lower protections. It's still going to absolutely shred you, which you don't want. So, E-Staff, can it work? Yes, but you're basically gambling. Well, I say you're gambling. It would be at the end of the game you build this. So if you look at the enemy's build at the end of the game and you're not seeing too much penetration, yeah, you can get away with this. Otherwise, I personally prefer protections. Again, for the Cthulhu, I really specifically do prefer the Spirit Robe. But for a lot of other situations, you can get this to work if the enemy team doesn't build too hard into penetration. Again, that's something you're going to have to look at the enemy build at the end of the game and decide for yourself if you can get that to work. Otherwise, I would go for protections. Totally up to you, but just treat it with some caution. Now, back to the scheme. Back to the original point here. Sylvanas is good with Animosity, Cthulhu is good with Animosity, Yamoja is actually fairly good with Animosity because she gets 20% of her mana converted into health, so any items you build with mana get converted into health. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of your builds, Animosity builds, they don't typically build health, but there is a really interesting, and I opened with E-Staff very specifically with Sylvanas because I wanted to talk about E-Staff in Yamoja's specific situation, because Yamoja with E-Staff is very interesting. Now, running an Animosity build on Yamoja is a really interesting time due to a variety of fascinating little factors. We're just going to go on ahead and do the usual run here. And we're going to go on ahead and just a special note, Contagion means you get a little extra mana. That is very specifically, I think it's, I want to say it's 50 extra health. It's not that much, but just a little aside there. And then we have this. And then let's talk about E-Staff with Yamoja. Now we go into this like this. Alright, now again, keep in mind that this is actually 60 less, so we'd be looking at 241 and 212 protections. But E-Staff is particularly interesting on Yamoja. You're stealing 6% of the target's maximum health and 8% of their maximum mana. That mana increase, 20% of that is actually going to go into HP, so for Yamoja very specifically, that is a really heavy spike into HP. Now, keep in mind, again, we're talking 4,136 max HP, which is 124 bonus damage very specifically. That excludes E-Staff's bonuses. And Yamoja is the only Guardian that I consistently build E-Staff as the final item, even if the enemy has a good amount of penetration, because that mana is actually becoming health. So that's enough of a bonus amount of health where it's going to eke you into, well, unless they're building a large amount of chin size, I don't care, right? And it's absolutely phenomenal in terms of Yamoja at the very least, because it's going to spike your health and therefore your damage considerably. Furthermore, there's this additional happy bonus of you to some extent wanting your auto attacks to be good anyways, because you're already going to be able to use these to heal your allies. So in a team fight, what you can really do is, you know, try to... Yamoja's odd because in a team fight with an animosity build, you want to be standing just behind your allies, shooting through them to heal them to some extent, and damaging the enemy beyond with animosity. Now, there are going to be some situations in which you're going to be in front of your allies, for example, if you're trying to body block, obviously, but your default position should be right in the middle of your group. They get the benefit of Gauntlet of Thebes. They're all going to get the benefit of Gauntlet of Thebes because you're right there in the middle. They're all going to get the benefits of Shogun's Gusari. And they're going to, at least your front line is going to get the benefit of your healing. You're generally, actually, interestingly enough, going to want to stick with your solo laner when you pull this. Just because you're going to want to heal them pretty consistently. They're going to be frontline with you. That's generally going to be a really magical time. But E-Staff is extremely powerful on Yamoja because her mana is being converted to health, and that's actually going to boost that enough where in most situations, there are obviously some situations in which it isn't good enough, but in a lot of situations, that's going to be enough of a health, it's enough of a bonus, you know, after the first couple of buffs, that it doesn't really make a difference in terms of, you know, penetration or whatever. So E-Staff is a really strong option for you if you're playing Yamoja and you want to do an animosity build. But she's, I would say, the best example of using E-Staff for this. Now let's talk about Terra. Terra's fairly standard, but it is interesting to note that her auto attacks are already doing bonus damage. Now you see that 10% magic power and you're like, ooh, let's build magic power. I don't recommend that. Just go on ahead and stick with the delicious animosity because you're already going to be building. I mean, consider, for example, let's actually go full into this. I forgot to clear this out. Let's have this whole conversation. Once again, build this. We're just going to go on ahead and go Witchblade for her because I prefer it on her in all honesty. And then we're going to go into, I'm trying to think, I think Pridwin probably would be best here. And then, of course, Stone of Fall. Now, the interesting thing here is we're actually going to go on ahead and throw this down here really quick. And also actually really quickly this. Now, I mentioned with Sylvanas that I don't normally build Lotus Crown on him because it doesn't offer me any bonus health. There are other things I prefer. However, it is something I build fairly frequently with Terra. Not all the time, obviously. I'm using Witchblade as an example for auto attacks because auto attackers have been really big. But, in all honesty, Lotus Crown is actually a fairly strong option here because, again, you are, in fact, pulling in some of your magic power from your items. Hold on, I'm going to sneeze. No. So you're pulling in some of your magic power from your items. Yes, I did. Into your auto attacks. So actually, Lotus Crown isn't as damaging to your damage output as you'd think. 10% of your magic power is 3 magic power. You're losing the 250 health here. That is 7 damage. So you're losing 4 damage per auto attack. So it's really not a big deal if you want to go into Lotus Crown. Again, I usually do with Terra, where I don't normally with Sylvanas. because it really doesn't have that big of an impact. You still get to do the give your allies protections when you heal them, and of course Terra heals. So it is a really strong option for her here. Again, I'm using Pridwin for the cooldowns. Witchblade is great for cooldowns as well, because you want to have those abilities up. But she does actually do really well with an auto-attacking build. You can build any of these and just be perfectly fine, of course. Now, I want to talk about, finally, last but not least, I want to talk about some very specific people. Jormungandr, I've tested this. Because his immovable does not proc item hit effects, animosity does not work on him. So don't try. I've tried, because I didn't believe it when I first read this back when he was first released. Believe it. There are some other Guardians that I want to talk about. Sobek, fairly standard form, but his Blessing of Denial does work with basic attacks, so if you want to run an Animosity Sobek, that can work. I personally still prefer to run him with an ability focus, but he can make an Animosity build work as well, and still perform extremely well at that. Same thing with Atlas, partially because of his Astrolabe, just gives you bonus damage anyways, so to some extent you want to be using that anyways. Again, I personally prefer to build him somewhat ability-based. I personally prefer a Polynomicon build on him. I like to splash Poly on him for some extra damage, not necessarily Animosity, but he does work well with Animosity as well. Don't get me wrong on that. Same thing with Cabrakan. Makes his Seismic Crush fairly interesting, because that does technically this is still an auto attack. So it does work with Animosity, which is fairly interesting. Again, he's one of those Guardians I prefer Polynomicon with, but again, that can be down to your preference. Now, it's interesting to note with Athena that Athena and Ymir, very specifically, are the two Guardians I don't Animosity with. And that's because for both of them, they have a passive that increases their basic attack damage, and this 50% increased damage does not increase your Animosity damage. Animosity damage is considered separate from your basic attack. It is bonus damage attached to the basic attack. It is not actually directly enhancing the basic attack. Same way as Chin Size works. As a result, Reach and Ymir's Frostbite don't boost that. So for very specifically Ymir and Athena, I do build Gilded Arrow, because Gilded Arrow and eventually Diamond Arrow are going to get the benefits of that, because Gilded Arrow and Diamond Arrow extremely specifically do in fact increase your basic attack damage. So that actually does benefit, because it's actually increasing it at the stat level. So it does in fact gain the benefit of those passives. These are the only two Guardians I don't build Animosity on, although I will point out that Athena's passive does mean you get basically a long distance Animosity hit, so she could potentially still really work well with it. I haven't ever personally played it, because I still prefer her with the Gilded Arrow build when I am going to do damage with her. But if you want to try it, you absolutely can and should probably. At some point I do intend on trying this, but I expect to find that it's not going to be as effective for her as Gilded Arrow or Diamond Arrow is, specifically because of the bonus damage from Reach. Beyond that, the rest of these Guardians really play okay with it. I've talked about most of the standouts. There is a caveat for Fafnir. Interestingly enough, his Coerce increases your attack speed, which you can use on yourself, so there is that potential where if you're stuck boxing someone, you can just coerce yourself to have increased attack speed, and you can really tear through people with Animosity. The only real problem I have with this is the Draconic Corruption. The Dragon Breath doesn't trigger Animosity, so you're only triggering Animosity when you're not in your old form, which kind of then nerfs your damage output when you become a dragon, which I don't like. Basically, you're just swapping your auto attack damage for ability based damage. It's not a complete disadvantage if the enemy has a disarm that can be really, or somebody with fairly frequent disarms like Bellona, that can be an advantage, but I just don't normally run Fafnir on an Animosity build because the dragon form doesn't apply that. and that kind of bothers me, but fair enough. So that's animosity builds, generally speaking. That's generally how I'm going to approach animosity builds. Those are the guardians that do and do not work well with it, very specifically, and ones that I would suggest you try as well. Now let's talk about warrior. You know what? Actually, we'll save the warriors up for another episode. I think we're already running at 40 minutes, and if I talk about warriors this episode, that's going to actually take, heavens, another half hour at least. So we're going to go ahead and save the warriors now that we've laid the groundwork down of what an animosity build is. I do, actually, really quickly before I end the episode off, I do want to talk about some guardians and how you would adjust their builds. We're going to start with the most obvious one, Ares. Obviously, he gets bonus magic power from having aura items, so you're going to want to build some items over others. For example, there's for your physical protections, there's really not a whole lot of wrong moves there. But overall, it's not really going to heavily affect your Ares build, except in one instance. One very specific instance. In the previous episode, I talked about how Talisman of Energy is more effective in some situations than Shogun's Kusari. Not for Ares. I don't care what the situation is. I don't care what the context is. If you have a lot of auto attackers on your team and Shogun's Kusari is the choice, don't even think about Talisman of Energy. Just go for Shogun's Kusari. I don't care what your allies' movement speed is. Shogun's Kusari is the way. Okay? Also, even if you play Ares really aggressively, at least give some thought to Gauntlet of Thebes. It does become an aura item once it's done building those stacks. It is very powerful on him. Just as a kind of aside, this is typically why I'll play Ares mildly passively. I still play him more aggressively than a lot of other Guardians, but Gauntlet of Thebes is a big reason why I like to play him a little bit safer in the early game, especially considering the fact that you're dealing with, so many enemies, and his damage really comes online in the late game anyways. So there's that. RTO does... Actually, there are a lot of Guardians that... I won't say a lot of Guardians. There are a couple of Guardians that do better with Voidstone than a lot of other things. Decompose actually is fairly interesting because she is reducing physical and magical protections. So for RTO, I build Voidstone a lot more because Voidstone works with that. That is a lot of magic protections down. Very specifically, it is... Gosh, I think it's 22%? Yes. It's 22% reduction of their magic protections, so as a result, even though it doesn't seem like much, Mystical Mail is rather startlingly effective here because they have 22% less protections, magic protections. Mystical Mail, while it's only going to be a matter of single-digit damage numbers, if they're taking that every second, that really does stack up well, so I typically build Mystical Mail a lot more often on RDO than I would normally. So there is that as well. I just wanted to kind of point that out. Also, Pridwin, again, this is magic damage. Pridwin is abnormally effective on RTO. I typically build this a lot more often on her than I would on a lot of other Guardians as well. Very powerful. Voidstone, Mystical Mail, and Pridwin are items I build in RTO a lot, for specifically that reason. Also, interestingly enough, see, the thing about, and this is one other thing I want to mention about Animosity. Animosity, I've been talking about all these damage numbers. This doesn't include the enemy's magic protections. Even though I don't normally build Animosity on RDO, the fact that she reduces enemy magic protections by 22% is a really good thing for an Animosity build. Just throwing that out there. Something to consider. We've talked about Atlas. There's really not much else going on there. Bacchus, just as a kind of reminder, because a lot of people forget this, he gets damage mitigation. He also gets protections, but that you can't really do a whole lot with that. He gets damage mitigations. Now, there's a couple of actual interesting things here. First off, Chug gives you a good 70 protections. That's 35 of each. Right, so that's 70 total protections. He's actually, and I don't have this here because my last episode was with Bacchus Jungle and I haven't adjusted this after that. My goodness, this is everywhere. There's a couple of things about Bacchus that I really want to point out. First off, Oni Hunter's Garb is particularly effective on him. That goes, that's fairly obvious. Same thing with Spirit Robe. Spirit Robe is abnormally effective on him for the same reason. But I want to actually really quickly point out, I've already talked about Polynomicon being really effective on Bacchus. What a lot of people don't think about is taking Bacchus into the solo lane and using very specifically Sundering Axe, right? Every time you chug, you're increasing your protections by 70 plus whatever you already have. So Sundering Axe, that's 2% of your protections. Let's assume you've got my favorite 250, that's 500, and then we have 570. Right, that is plus 2% of your protection from items. So, yeah, that is an impressive 11.4 extra. Not in flat damage, it's like... No, that is in flat damage. And plus 2% of their current health. This actually is fairly nice on him. No, that's current protection from items. Never mind. I forgot they changed that. I'm having a brain fart. Ignore me. Well, I mean, Bacchus is still very effective with Polynomicon there. Same thing with Cabrakan. We already talked about Cabrakan. Again, Cabrakan with his Shadow Zone ability, already giving basically everyone around you 5% damage mitigation. Spirit Robe and Oni Hunter's Garb are very effective on him. Cerberus, again, we're talking about Ghastly Breath. We have protection reduction here, flat protection reduction, which actually is very effective as well. This is flat protection reduction up to 3 times, which means 39 flat protection reduction. That happens after the protection reductions from Voidstone. So Voidstone is reducing their magic protections by 10%, and then you're reducing it by an additional 39 afterwards. Mystical Mail is also really potent on Cerberus as well. But Cerberus is a little bit better at dealing with squishier targets, because this is flat protection reduction, which... a lot of squishy targets, they're not going to have the magic protections. Artio is a bit better at dealing with tankier targets. So it's a really interesting comparison. Basically, it comes down to the flat being better for the squishies versus the percentage being better against the tankier ones. Just adjust accordingly when you play either of them. But I basically run him the same way as Artio. He's just better at dealing with squishier targets than she is. Fafnir I haven't used in a hot minute because he is the epitome of too slow, unfortunately. Just because it takes him so long to really get online, because he really doesn't start to actually slap until he gets to level 5, which takes a little while. I would one day want to take him into a nice... One day I would like to take him into a damage roll. But, again, we already mentioned Coerce is potentially very useful for an animosity build, except for the dragon problem. I also tend to build Voidstone on him as well, but not necessarily as often, because it's only when he's a dragon, obviously, so it doesn't make quite the same amount of difference. Excuse me. Ganesh is just amazing. I don't really adjust my build for him necessarily. I do like building Mystical Mail because of his Dharmic Pillars. Again, Voidstone is also fairly nice on him, but beyond that, again, we have a lot of protection reductions. Fairly, and Pridwin as well, obviously. What I really wish... I'm going to talk about this for a second because I'm kind of upset about it. Height of the Enemy Line used to reflect auto attack damage, 20% of auto attack damage back to the dealer as physical damage. I miss that. I played a really deadly Khepri, where basically I was just killing people with their own reflected damage. With this, I wish they brought that back. I don't like this passive. I've talked about how I don't like this passive before, how it's pretty useless, and how I just don't build it all. In fact, the only person I build this on is Athena, because her block stacks, she can really stack this up with the Height of the Enemy Line really nicely. So this is actually only good on Athena, in my opinion. Again, my opinion. that she's the only one that can really actually make use of this. But I still would prefer the damage reflection back. I think that would really help Guardians out a lot. I think that'd be really nice to see. Maybe reflect back 15%? I don't know. But I really liked that. I really missed that. I would have loved to have played Ganesh with that. Is there anything else I'm thinking of? We've already talked about Terra and Sylvanas with their healing. We've talked about Yamoja with E-Staff. We've talked about Ymir with the Gilded Arrow. We've talked about Xingtian with Soul Reaver in a different episode. Because of shell spikes, I've never actually, and if, no, we're not going to talk about it. You know the deal with shell spikes. No, I think we've covered everything here, I think. Yes, I think we've covered everything in particular. Although, I will actually mention really quickly that E-Staff has a lot of benefits for Kumbhakarna. I want to mention this last point really quickly before I end the episode. And the reason why we're actually going to save this really quick, a lot of people don't realize that when you come back, it's a percentage of your max health and mana. I don't know how many people are aware of this. Nobody talks about it, absolutely. But what a lot of people don't realize, and what I'm more specifically getting at, is E-Staff. Now, when Sleepy triggers, you don't technically die, alright? You still have whatever buffs and debuffs are typically on you at the time, right? So, if you have a healthy amount of buffs from E-Staff, and you go down, you still have those buffs. So as long as the E-Staff buffs, which last for stinking 45 seconds, as long as you're still asleep at that time, and you're probably going to have those buffs at that time, you're going to get back up with way more health and mana than you normally would. So E-Staff is something that is under-purchased on Kumbhakarna a lot of the times, in my opinion. And that's a really fun little interaction that I've never seen anyone take advantage of. I've only done one episode on Kumbhakarna. I didn't use it then because I was talking about other things, but one day I would like to go into an episode with Kumbhakarna with E-Staff and show you, and I'll probably do that pretty soon. I want to do a couple more episodes on Hunbots first, and I want to do these episodes, well, Hunbots very specifically, but that is, you can really increase your return health and mana by using E-Staff, and no one's really talked about this. So, on that interesting note, we're going to go ahead and leave this episode here. We'll talk about Warriors next time. I apologize, but this episode, talking about Animosity, took a little bit longer than I was expecting. But we'll definitely talk about Warriors next time. So, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.